Today I want to share with you how to make a healthy powdered coffee creamer that's a shelf-stable pantry staple. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Now I want to go over all of the options involved in making a homemade powdered coffee creamer, but if you want to jump ahead to where I'm actually making it, be sure to check the timestamps in the description below. The nice thing about making your own homemade powdered coffee creamer is that you know what goes into it. And you can also customize the flavors to come up with some very unique varieties that may not be sold at the store. But more importantly is that you know the ingredients going into it. Because if you look at the ingredients of some of the powdered creamers sold at the grocery store, they can be a little off-putting. Often the first ingredient is corn syrup solids. And then the second ingredient is often partially hydrogenated soybean oil. Now, corn solids can be problematic for people who don't want something that's genetically modified, because that's often is a GMO product. Often people also have trouble with corn. They find it to be very inflammatory. And also, there are differences of opinions on how corn syrup is processed in the body, so it may not be the healthiest option. Then when it comes to soybean oil is a very highly processed oil. And so it can be sort of considered like a damaged fat. And that obviously is not great for our bodies. But when they partially hydrogenate it, it goes through a process to make it more solid, and that further damages it. So given that those are usually the first two ingredients in a coffee creamer, a powdered coffee creamer at the grocery store, it may be something that we want to avoid. And something that we especially want to avoid if we're running a traditional foods kitchen, because I think some of those ingredients a lot of traditional cultures didn't have, nor did our grandmothers. And if you're on your journey from a processed foods kitchen, moving from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, starting with making your own coffee creamer can be a great place to start. First, let's talk about equipment that we're going to need. You have a lot of options here. When I make small amounts of this, I really like these little, they're often sold for grinding coffee beans. They're these just little grinders, and these work great at combining all of the ingredients and getting them nice and smooth so they dissolve nicely when you put them into your hot coffee. Secondly, you can also use a food processor, which we'll use today since we'll make a larger amount. But you can also use a high-speed blender. If you have one of those like little Nutri blenders that are in many ways similar to the little coffee bean grinders, they work very well. You can also use just a regular blender, but if you use a regular blender, you're probably going to want to stop periodically and just use a spatula just to kind of scrape down the sides a little and mix things up a little, somewhat to a certain extent what we need to do when we use the food processor, and I'll show you when we go through that process, because you want to make sure that everything is getting very well combined and very well pulverized. But with these little coffee grinders, the sort of the Nutri blender kind of blenders, and the high-speed blenders, they do a great job, and like literally probably within 30 seconds. Now let's go over all the different ingredients that you can use to make this. There's a lot of different combinations that you can use and a lot of different flavorings that you can use. But don't worry, you don't need to write any of this down, because if you open the description under this video, just look for the word recipe. There'll be a link there, and that'll take you directly over to the recipe where I'll list all the different combinations. Now you can make a dairy option of this, which is normally what I do, but you can also make a non-dairy option of this, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first let's focus on the dairy options. Now your first options when you're making a dairy-based coffee creamer are the instant non-fat dry milk or simply the non-fat dry milk powder. Now, When it comes to using these to make coffee creamers, it doesn't matter if yours says instant or doesn't say instant. Where that generally comes in is if you're turning either of these into milk. And just for a little background information, this will turn into milk very easily. You can put some in a cup, swirl it with a spoon, and it's water, and you're all set. This generally is better made in a blender. So that's really the difference between instant and non-instant, but both dissolve beautifully in hot liquid, so they're perfect for making coffee creamer, whatever you have. So these are best used if you want to make a non-fat coffee creamer, a non-fat powdered coffee creamer. And they work very well, and they provide a very nice mouthfeel in your coffee drink. And you really don't necessarily miss the fat. Given that they're dry milk and somewhat a little concentrated, they work very well. So if you need to go no fat, this is a wonderful option for making a creamer. Now, instant non-fat dry milk is pretty easy to find at most grocery stores. If you're looking for an organic non-fat dry milk, this can be a little harder to find. I have not seen this at my grocery store. Generally, this is at your specialty grocery stores like Whole Foods or online. I actually bought this online, so if this is the type of thing you're looking for, I'll put a link to this in the description below. But if you have specialty grocery stores in your area, check there because they may carry it. Now, you can also make this powdered coffee creamer out of whole milk powder. Now that's a little harder to find. You're probably going to have to look for that online. This is an organic one. This is the Prescribed for Life. I know some of you have asked me what brand of whole milk powder I like, and I like this one. I feel it mixes very well. This is going to make a much richer flavored coffee creamer. So if that's the type of thing that you like, you can definitely use the whole milk powder. This is an organic one, and this is also by Prescribed for Life. This is not organic, but these are definitely going to be increasing in price as opposed to your non-fat milk powders, and definitely more expensive than your instant non-fat that you can find at your grocery store. But these work very well in making you know, these coffee creamers, these powdered coffee creamers, and they make a very rich coffee creamer. I actually find that the non-fat milks work very well. You really don't necessarily miss the fat in these because since they are concentrated and dried. But this is nice, especially if you're maybe really wanting that added fat. And it does give a slightly different mouthfeel as opposed to using the non-fat dry milk. So it's definitely worth trying and experimenting and seeing what you like. Now another option is using a heavy cream powder. Now this is going to make a very, very rich powdered coffee creamer. And what I generally recommend is if you can't find these whole milk powders, or you just find they're a little, you know, pricey, which I do find that sometimes they're a little more affordable. It depends. Sometimes the supply and demand. And during this time, you know, that we've been going through right now, these types of things have become somewhat expensive. This is made by Hoosier Hill Farm, I think. Yeah, Hoosier Hill Farm. And they make a lot of nice dehydrated type or dried powders. And you can take this heavy cream powder, mix it with your non-fat milk powder, and as I said, these are, I think, you know, a little more affordable, and that makes a wonderful creamer. You really almost start getting into something that's more like a half and half, and these work very well. Now, no matter what type of dry milk powder you use or heavy cream powder, the formula is always going to be the same. It's going to be 3 parts of your dry milk powder or cream or heavy cream powder to 1 part sweetener or slightly more. I like to use about 1 part, 3 to 1. If you want it to taste even sweeter, almost a little more similar to what's sold at the store, you're going to add a little bit more than that 1 part of sweetener. And again, I'll have all of this in the written recipe, so don't worry. Now, if you want to make a non-dairy option of this, you can definitely do that, and you'll want to use coconut milk powder. And I was very surprised. I found this at my local grocery store, and it was in the baking aisle, and it was right next to the instant non-fat dry milk. So that's definitely something to keep your eyes open for. And this is organic, and it's 7 ounces, and it was $4.41. So it's a little pricey, but if you can't have dairy and you want to start making your own coffee creamer homemade, this is definitely a good option. So keep your eyes open for this at your grocery store. I live in a little town, so the fact that my grocery store carried this definitely indicates that more and more people are looking for dairy-free options. And on this package it says it's also gluten-free. Now, since instant non-fat dry milk is the easiest to find, that's what I'm going to use today to make this creamer. But no matter what you decide to use, whether you're going with the organic non-fat dry milk powder, the coconut milk powder, or one of the whole milk powders, or even your heavy cream powder, or if you're going to mix these two, the non-fat dry milk with the heavy cream powder, whatever combination you're going to do, the process is the same. Now, the next ingredient we need to talk about is the sweetener. Now, if you're at the very beginning of your journey, you know, from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, you may not be incorporating whole sugars yet into your pantry. If you are, great, but if all you have at this point is white sugar, you can definitely use that. I really believe that something made with just instant non-fat dry milk and white sugar is going to be better than something made with corn solids and partially hydrogenated soybean oil and so on and so forth. But what I like to use is Sucanat. I've talked to you all about this a lot, I think, and it just stands for sugar cane natural, Sucanat. And all it is a dried sugar cane juice. So it's got all the vitamins and the minerals in it. And a question that I've received a lot, especially from my sweet friends in India, is can you use jaggery? And forgive me if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, J-A-G-G, E-R-Y. But yes, that's basically Sucanat. It's the same thing. It's simply dried sugarcane juice. So that is definitely an option. And another option is coconut sugar. And this is made, I really like this, the Wholesome brand. And often I see these on and off at my grocery store and also on and off at the specialty stores. So just keep your eyes open. You know, there's always different varieties and different brands. But this is the brand that I'll often see at my grocery store, and this is coconut sugar. This works very well. It doesn't have a coconut flavor. It has, I find the flavor similar to Sucanat, just sort of similar to like a brown, like a light brown sugar or a dark brown sugar flavor. Another option, but I find that this is more difficult to find, is date sugar. That can work very well, and that's a nice whole sweetener. Another option is maple sugar. Now, maple sugar can lean towards a little more pricey side, but if that's something that you want to buy, and if you're looking to give your creamer somewhat of a maple flavor, that would work very well. But today I'm going to go ahead and use Sucanat, since that's the most common sweetener that I tend to rely on. Now, I just wanted to show you up close how Sucanat looks. It's very grainy, and it's very similar to coconut sugar is going to be very grainy like that. Maple sugar, not so much, but date sugar is going to be a little grainy. And so there's a little trick that you need to do when you're making this type of homemade coffee creamer so that this turns into a powdered form and will blend easier when added to your coffee. I'll usually just grind this, you know, as I said, in my little coffee bean grinder here. It works very well, but today we'll make a larger amount, so we'll use the food processor to do this. So in making this coffee creamer, this powdered coffee creamer, the first thing that we're going to do is grind up our sugar so that it is in a powdered form. Now, before we grind up our sugar, I want to mention something about turning these into flavored powdered coffee creamers. Now, we're going to go over making a lot of different flavors, but the one that needs some special attention is if you want to make a vanilla flavored coffee creamer. This is a vanilla bean pod, and if you want to make a vanilla coffee creamer, I highly recommend that you make a vanilla flavored sugar. And the way that you would do this is by putting your sugar in whatever canister that you want to keep it in, and then adding your vanilla bean. I tend to split it so that it really releases a lot of fragrance. Now, over the course of a couple of weeks, months, whatever the case may be, your sugar, whether it's sucanat or coconut sugar, whatever you're using, is going to start to take on the flavor of your vanilla bean pod. And then you will have your vanilla sugar to use in making your coffee creamer. Now, if you're in a bit of a rush and you don't have time to make vanilla sugar, what you can do is take your pod and cut it in half, and then add that half a pod into your blender, or in this case, the food processor, with your sugar, and blend it until this is very well pulverized with your sugar. However, these are expensive. And I really recommend that if you can wait and you're not in a rush, to simply make your vanilla sugar, because this will be so fragrant and it will make your sugar smell like vanilla for a very long time. I mean, as you add, you can use some, you can add more in, use it, add more in, and the vanilla fragrance and flavor will be imparted over many, many, many months. So you really get your money's worth out of your vanilla pod. I have vanilla sugar that, I'll tell you the truth, I've made years ago, and it's still just got that same pod in there. And it's still, as I add more and more sugar to it, over time, it takes on that vanilla flavor and fragrance. It's wonderful. So really think about that, because, as I said, these are pricey. So you don't necessarily just want to use it to make one batch. Alrighty, well, I've got my sugar in my food processor, and now we'll get ready to pulse it. Now, this in a food processor is going to take about 2 minutes to get to a nice powder, and you're just going to want to stop it halfway through and just push down the sides, anything that's coming up on the sides. And this is the same thing you'd do if you were doing this in a regular blender. You want to make sure that everything gets well pulverized. So after about 2 minutes, it'll be ground into a lovely powder. And I just used 1 cup. If you like your coffee creamer very sweet, then you'll want to increase it to 1 1/8 cups. Now let's talk about some flavoring options. As I said, if you're going with the vanilla, if you can make the vanilla sugar in advance, all the better. Otherwise, you can go ahead, and you really only need about half of the vanilla bean, because they have a very strong flavor. You could even try 1/4 of the vanilla bean and see what you think of that. But the other option at this stage, say you've just used regular sugar, you don't have, whatever sweetener you're using, sucanat or coconut sugar, whatever the case may be, whatever you're using, and you've not turned it into a vanilla sugar, and you don't want to use a vanilla bean, the other option is something called vanilla powder. Now, that's a little more hard to find. I've not seen that sold at my grocery store. It's generally something you have to buy online. Places like King Arthur Flour and Breadtopia may sell it. I'm not 100% sure. It's not something that I keep in my kitchen, but if you do have a source for vanilla powder and you want to use that, then at this stage, you'll go ahead and add in your tablespoon of vanilla powder. And I find that a tablespoon of most of these flavorings that we're going to talk about, except for the cocoa powder, a tablespoon of some type of spice or a vanilla powder gives a lovely flavor. Now, if you want to do any of these sort of fall spice flavors, like a pumpkin pie spice or an apple pie spice, you can just use pumpkin pie spice powder or apple pie spice powder. That's a tongue twister. But both of these will work well. And you'll just put a tablespoon in for the amount that we're making, the 3 to 1, 3 cups of the powdered milk to 1 part sugar. So just a tablespoon of either or of these. And if you want to just do plain cinnamon, you could put a tablespoon of cinnamon powder in here. Now, if you want to make this a chocolate creamer, that'll then give you a nice mocha flavored coffee, you're going to want to use an unsweetened cocoa powder. And in this case, you're going to want to put in 2 tablespoons. That's going to give you a nice chocolatey mocha flavor. And if you really want to intensify the flavor of your creamer, if you're using a cocoa powder, you can also add in a teaspoon of espresso powder or just a dried coffee powder, freeze-dried coffee powder. That will really intensify the flavor and just make your overall coffee stronger, but it'll be a very strong mocha flavor. Now, if you want to do a mint-flavored coffee creamer, what I would recommend is very similar to what you would do with the vanilla bean. Now, what I've got here is some dried mint. And this is just from my garden, and you can just leave, if you grow mint, you can just leave it out in the air on your counter and it'll dry up beautifully. And then you can add this to some sugar, whatever type whole sugar you're using, or if you're at the very beginning of your journey to a Traditional Foods Kitchen, just white sugar. But what you're going to want to do is, again, let this sit for a little while. And over the next couple of weeks, your sugar will take on a very minty flavor. Now, if you don't have mint from your garden and you want to buy mint in the little jar, the dried mint in the spice section of your grocery store, you can definitely use that too. But mint is strong, so you don't need a lot. But what you'll have to do is, if you're not using it to flavor your sugar, and you want to go ahead and add it right in, you will add it in at this stage and you're going to whirl it till it's very well pulverized. But then before you add in your milk powder, you're going to want to take the sugar out of whatever vessel you're grinding it in, and you're going to want to sift it in a strainer just to get out any little bits and pieces of the dried mint so that it's not floating around in your coffee. But it will, at that point, after pulverizing it in with your sugar, it will dispense that minty flavor into your sugar. Now, one other flavor I want to mention is coconut. If you like a coconut coffee creamer, you can take some coconut milk powder, even though you're making a dairy version of this, and you'll want to add 2 tablespoons of your coconut milk powder to your coffee creamer in the making, and whirl that in with your sugar, and that will add a coconut flavor. But whatever flavor you decide to use, you want to add it at this point after you've turned your sugar. Even if you're using white sugar, if you start with powdered sugar, then you would just put your powdered sugar in here and you wouldn't need to whirl it, to turn it into a powdered form, because it was already in a powdered form. However, this is the point where, once it's in a powdered form, that you're going to add your flavoring. And the reason is, you want this very well incorporated with your sweetener before we even add in the milk powder. Now, since we're in the fall, I'm going to go ahead and use this pumpkin pie spice. And as I said, with any of the spice mixtures, we're just going to go with a tablespoon. So to your 1 cup of sweetener, you're going to add a tablespoon of, whether it's the pumpkin pie spice or the apple pie spice or just plain cinnamon, anything like that. Ginger, if you want to use ginger, you can certainly do that. That might be like a very therapeutic coffee drink, coffee creamer. In any event, so that's what you just go ahead, put that in, and then we're going to give this a whirl to really get it well incorporated with the whole sweetener. Now we're going to go ahead and add in our 3 cups of powdered milk. Well, I've got the 3 cups of powdered milk in there, and now I'm going to whirl this for about 60 seconds. Well, this is mixed beautifully now. And as I said, if you see a lot coming up around the sides, just stop it halfway through at about the 30-second mark. Use your spatula just to brush things down on the side. But it is blended really well. And the smell, the aroma of that pumpkin pie spice is heavenly. I can't wait to try this. Now, you may see a lot of recipes that call for also adding into this coconut oil, but I don't add any coconut oil into my powdered creamer. And the reason is, I like this to be very shelf stable. This milk, this particular non-fat dry milk powder, has a best buy date of April 23rd, 2022. So this has a very good shelf life. Now, your coconut milk powder and your whole milk powders are going to have a shorter shelf life because they do contain the fat, but even so, they have a pretty good shelf life as well. If you introduce coconut oil, you introduce moisture. And once you introduce moisture, even though coconut oil does have a good shelf life just on its own, but once you introduce moisture to any milk powder, you start to decrease its shelf life. So if you add coconut oil to your coffee creamer, I don't recommend storing this in your pantry. Instead, if you add any coconut oil to your homemade coffee creamers, I would recommend refrigerating them. And you're going to have to keep in mind that since you've more or less activated, so to speak, your powdered milk by exposing it to moisture, it may have a shelf life more similar to liquid milk. So you might have to start worrying about rancidity and a much shorter shelf life. Also, too, I don't really find that these homemade coffee creamers need the coconut oil. I also am not a fan of it. I find it gives an unusual mouthfeel and does impart a little bit of flavor, especially if you're using the unrefined coconut oil. So I would recommend leaving out coconut oil. Well, let's make a cup of coffee and give this a try. Now, while my coffee's brewing, I'm just going to decant this up into my storage container. You're going to need something, that can hold about a quart. Since we've got about four quarts, we've got about 4 cups of powder here. So a quart-sized canning jar will work great, or a little jar like this, but something that has a nice tight lid, especially if you're going to put this in the pantry. Trying to keep out as much air as possible is a good idea. And speaking of coffee brewing, this is a good time to tell you about my 2 coffee pots, since I get a lot of questions about that. And I've answered it in comments from time to time, but in case you missed it, the reason why I have 2 coffee pots is that during this time when so many of us were home, for a good 6 months, I had a full house. And so I had to have 2 coffee pots up and running in the morning. But now I've decided to keep them because my husband likes decaf coffee, which is what I was just drinking with him beforehand. But then I got a little spoiled getting back to caffeinated coffee, because I always like caffeinated coffee. And so now I'm just going to keep the 2 coffee pots, one for him and his decaf, and one for me and my caffeinated. So 2 coffee pots. Now you can go ahead and store this right in your pantry. It doesn't need refrigeration. And it's got a wonderful shelf life because, as I mentioned earlier, right now we're in the fall of 2020, and this has a best by date. The powdered milk, the instant non-fat dry milk, it has a best by date of April 23rd, 2022. And the Sucanat has a best by date of way into the future, April 2024. So this has got a pretty good shelf life. If you want to be overly cautious, you could say at least 1 year, but I would go even farther, given that the milk has a 2022 and the sugar has a 2024 expiration or best by date. But you're going to use this a lot faster than that. And speaking of the pantry, if you've not had a chance to download my Traditional Foods pantry list yet, which is 36 pages long and it's totally free, be sure to check the description below, because I'll have a link where you can head on over to my website and you can download that. And it'll be great to help you, especially if you're on your journey making that transition from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen. It'll really help walk you through all the things that you need as you're slowly, little by little, learning to stock a traditional foods pantry. Now I'm just going to use a tablespoon of this powdered creamer. I find that works well. If you've made yours with the whole milk or the heavy cream, the powdered heavy cream, or a combination that includes the whole milk or the heavy cream, you may even need less. But I find with the non-fat dry milk, a tablespoon works very well, but you can certainly add more. Now I used 1 tablespoon, I'm not sure if I misspoke in that previous segment, but I used 1 tablespoon of this powdered creamer. And this again we made with the non-fat milk. If yours is made with the whole milk powder or the whole milk powder and the heavy cream powder, or even the non-fat milk and the heavy cream powder, you may want to use less. It really depends what shade of your coffee that you like. Well, when you pour the coffee over the mixture, it really blends beautifully. You really don't even need to mix it, but I've got this just in case. But yeah, I don't feel any of the powder down on the bottom. It's actually blended very well. Alrighty, let's give this a taste. It's hot. Oh, that's a good cup of coffee. You really get all the nice pumpkin pie spice flavor coming through, and the sweetness, it's perfect. Well, if you'd like more ideas for how to make mixes like this for your pantry, including a hot chocolate mix, be sure to click on this video over here, and I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.